When Jaden Brooks counted the $15 in his wallet at the gas station at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, money that had to last until Friday's paycheck 3 days away and needed to cover his 3-year-old daughter Maya's daycare snack fee of $8 that was already 2 days overdue, and $7 of gas to get to work for 3 more days if he drove carefully and didn't take any unnecessary trips and prayed his car's fuel efficiency held up, and saw through the gas station window a young woman crying in her car on the side of the road with a flat tire and hazard lights flashing, and the particular desperation of someone who has no idea what to do next. He had a choice that wasn't really a choice once you understood what kind of person Jaden was. What raising a daughter alone had taught him about doing what's right, even when right costs everything you have. But what he gave her wasn't just money. It wasn't just $15 that represented 3 days of careful budgeting and skipping meals and walking instead of driving when possible, and the constant mathematics of poverty where every dollar has 3 jobs to do, and giving one away means something else doesn't get paid. It wasn't a good deed he'd forget by lunch. Wasn't casual charity from someone with resources to spare. Wasn't the kind of help that costs nothing to give. It was Sophie Bancroft, though Jaden didn't know her name yet. Daughter of Richard Bancroft, who owned a real estate empire worth $3.7 billion, stranded after running away from her own wedding that morning. Fled in her car still wearing her wedding dress, because staying meant marrying a man she didn't love, for reasons that had everything to do with business mergers and nothing to do with her heart. And when Jaden handed her his last $15 and said, "Get yourself somewhere safe," those 5 words carrying more concern for a stranger's well-being than for his own survival over the next 3 days, he had no idea that 24 hours later, 3 limousines would pull up to his apartment building in a neighborhood where limousines never appeared. That Sophie's father would step out offering not just gratitude, but opportunity. That giving away everything he had would open doors he didn't know existed. That his last $15 would become the investment that changed his daughter's entire future. Jaden Brooks was 24 years old and worked 2 jobs to support his 3-year-old daughter Maya, worked 8-hour shifts at a warehouse loading trucks and unloading deliveries that left his back aching and his hands calloused, then worked 4-hour night shifts doing security at an office building where he sat alone watching cameras and doing homework for the online college courses he was taking 1 class at a time. Because education was the only way out of poverty, but education cost money he barely had. Maya's mother had left when Maya was 6 months old, had decided that motherhood was too hard and poverty was too confining, and she wanted a life that didn't include diapers and daycare and the particular exhaustion of raising a baby. And she'd never come back, never sent child support, never called to check on the daughter she'd abandoned, leaving Jaden to raise Maya completely alone. He lived in a small studio apartment that cost $800 a month, barely making ends meet despite working 2 jobs, despite doing everything right, despite the bootstraps mythology that suggested hard work was enough, when the reality was that hard work plus 2 incomes still left him choosing between daycare fees and groceries, between gas money and keeping the lights on, between all the impossible choices poverty creates. This Tuesday morning, he had $15 until Friday's paycheck, had done the mathematics that defined his life, and knew he needed $8 for Maya's daycare snack fee that was already overdue, and $7 of gas to last 3 more days if he was very careful about driving. If he didn't make any extra trips, if nothing unexpected happened that required money he didn't have. Sophie Bancroft was 22 years old and had never had to count money the way Jaden counted money, was the daughter of Richard Bancroft, whose real estate empire made him worth $3.7 billion, had grown up with the particular privilege of never thinking about whether she could afford things, because everything was always affordable, never experiencing the stress of checking account balances or calculating how to make $15 last 3 days. She was supposed to have married Preston Kane that morning, wealthy man her father had chosen, controlling man who treated her like acquisition rather than person. Marriage that was really business merger between her father's real estate company and Preston's family's investment firm. Wedding that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with expanding wealth that didn't need expanding. But she'd run away from her own wedding that morning, had fled in her car still wearing her wedding dress because staying meant marrying someone she didn't love, meant living a life designed by her father rather than chosen by herself, meant being trapped in the same golden cage that had defined her entire privileged existence. Her car had broken down with a flat tire on the highway near the gas station where Jaden was counting his last $15. Phone dead because she'd forgotten her charger in the panic of running. No cash because people with wealth never carry cash. Everything is cards and accounts and money that exists in abstract rather than as bills you count and ration. Her cards were left at the wedding venue in the purse she'd abandoned when she ran, leaving her stranded and crying and completely helpless in ways that wealth hadn't prepared her for, had never had to handle crisis alone before, because money had always solved problems before problems became crises. At 7:42 a.m. at a gas station on a Tuesday morning, Jaden was stopping for gas he could barely afford, counting his last $15 with the particular attention poverty requires, calculating whether he could make this last until Friday, whether $8 for daycare and $7 for gas would be enough, or whether something unexpected would happen that would destroy his careful mathematics. He saw Sophie's car on the side of the road near the gas station, flat tire obvious, hazard lights flashing, and through her window he could see her crying, could see she was wearing a wedding dress, which was bizarre detail that suggested complicated story, could see the particular desperation of someone completely lost and alone, and having no idea what to do next. If you've ever had to choose between keeping your last dollar or giving it to someone who needed it more, subscribe to Love is Kindness for stories about the choices that cost everything but change everything. Would you give a stranger your last money if they were stranded and you knew helping them meant you couldn't eat for 3 days? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At 7:45 a.m., 3 minutes after counting his last $15 and doing the mathematics that said he couldn't afford to give away a single penny without consequences that would ripple through the next 3 days, Jaden saw Sophie's crisis and had a choice that people with resources never have to make. The choice between self-preservation and helping someone else, between keeping the little you have or giving it to someone who has even less, despite the fact that giving means going without. He could ignore it, could tell himself that he had his own problems, that a single father working 2 jobs and raising a daughter alone had enough to worry about without taking on strangers' emergencies, that survival required focusing on his own family, not on people he'd never met and would never see again. But he couldn't drive past someone crying, couldn't see another human being in distress and pretend not to notice, couldn't teach his daughter through his actions that helping people only matters when it's convenient, when it doesn't cost you anything, when you have resources to spare. So he approached Sophie's car, this stranger in a wedding dress crying in a broken-down vehicle on the side of the road, and knocked on her window with the gentleness of someone who understood that approaching crying women required care, required making sure she knew he wasn't a threat, wasn't someone she needed to fear on top of everything else she was dealing with. Sophie saw a stranger approaching and panicked with the particular terror of women alone and vulnerable, who've learned that men appearing unexpectedly can mean danger, that being stranded makes you target, that crying in public attracts attention that isn't always safe. "Hey," Jaden said through the window, his voice calm, his hands visible, his body language deliberate about not seeming threatening. "You okay? You need help?" Sophie was crying too hard to be coherent at first, words coming out broken by sobs and panic, and the overwhelming crash that comes when adrenaline from running away meets the reality of being completely helpless. "My tire's flat," she finally managed. "I don't have my phone. I don't have money. I don't know what to do." Each sentence revealing another layer of crisis, another way she was trapped, another reason she needed help she had no way of getting. Jaden processed the situation with a systematic assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate crises quickly, who'd spent 24 years navigating poverty and single fatherhood, and the constant problem-solving that both required, cataloging facts that added up to decision he was already making, even as he listed reasons. She was in a wedding dress, which meant she'd run away from something significant, had fled from her own wedding in the car she was driving, had chosen escape over whatever she was escaping, and wedding dresses in broken-down cars on Tuesday mornings told stories that didn't need explaining. She was genuinely terrified, not faking crisis or performing distress, but actually panicking in ways you couldn't fake. Fear and helplessness visible in every sob, in the way her hands shook, in the particular desperation of someone completely out of options. She had no phone and no money, which meant she was as helpless as anyone could be in situations like this. Couldn't call for tow truck or friend or anyone who might rescue her. Couldn't pay for services or transportation or anything that might get her somewhere safe. Was literally trapped by circumstance and complete lack of resources, despite the wedding dress that suggested wealth somewhere in her story. She was alone and vulnerable, which meant staying here was dangerous, meant every minute she sat in this car, she was at risk from traffic or from people with worse intentions than Jaden's, meant she needed to get somewhere safe immediately, not eventually. He had $15, his last money until Friday, money that was supposed to cover daycare fees and gas and nothing else, because there was nothing else. Money he couldn't afford to give away without consequences. But she needed help more than he needed gas. That was simple mathematics of a different kind. Moral mathematics that said her immediate crisis was more urgent than his ongoing poverty, that being stranded and terrified was worse than being broke for 3 more days. His daughter would want him to help. Maya, who was 3 and learning through his actions what kind of person her father was, what values mattered more than money, what it meant to be a good person even when being good cost everything. And this was what good people do. They help when help is needed. They give when they have nothing to give. They choose compassion over self-preservation because some choices define who you are in ways money never could. At 7:50 a.m., Jaden made the decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. Ask the question that mattered. "Where do you need to go?" "I don't know," Sophie said. The admission carrying the weight of someone who'd run without planning, who'd escaped without destination, who'd chosen away from over toward anything specific. "Away from here. I ran away from my wedding." The confession came out like relief, like speaking truth to someone who wouldn't judge, someone whose face showed only concern, not condemnation. "Okay," Jaden said simply, not asking why or who or any of the questions that would make this more complicated. "Here." He pulled out his wallet, extracted the $15, all of it, every bill, the 8 ones and the 5 and the 2 singles that together were supposed to last until Friday. "Take this. Get yourself somewhere safe. Call someone when you find a phone." "I can't take your money," Sophie protested, the response automatic, instinct from a lifetime of not needing help, saying she shouldn't accept, even when she desperately needed to accept. "You need it more than I do," Jaden said. The statement technically untrue because he needed it desperately, but morally true because immediate crisis trumped ongoing poverty, because being stranded now was more urgent than being broke later. "But you don't even know me," Sophie said, confusion mixing with gratitude because strangers didn't do this, didn't give away money they clearly needed, didn't help without wanting something in return. "You need help," Jaden said, the answer simple and complete and containing everything that mattered. "That's all I need to know. Get somewhere safe." That's what matters. Not who you are or why you ran or whether you can pay me back, just that you need help and I can give it. At 7:55 a.m., Sophie asked through tears the question that would make what happened next possible. "What's your name?" "Jaden," he said. "Jaden Brooks." "I'm Sophie," she replied, taking the $15 with hands that shook from relief and disbelief and gratitude she didn't know how to express. "Thank you. I'll pay you back. I promise I'll pay you back." "Don't worry about it," Jaden said, already walking back to his car because he was late for work now, because helping had cost him time along with money, because staying longer would make him even more late. And warehouse jobs didn't tolerate lateness from people they could easily replace. Just be safe. He drove away to work without putting gas in his car. Spent the $15 he'd been planning to use for fuel on a stranger's crisis instead. Used the fumes already in his tank to barely make it to the warehouse, his gauge reading empty by the time he pulled into the parking lot, his car running on hope and prayers, and the particular mercy of engines that keep working despite having no reason to keep working. He borrowed $5 from a coworker for gas to get home. Added another debt to the collection of small debts that poverty creates. Promised he'd pay it back Friday when his check came, even though Friday's check was already allocated to rent and daycare, and last week's groceries he'd bought on credit. He couldn't pay Maya's daycare snack fee, had to tell the daycare director that he'd pay Friday. Adding, "I promise," with the desperation of someone who knew his promises were becoming less believable each time he made them, whose credibility was being destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. He went to his night security job without dinner because he couldn't afford food, because the $5 he'd borrowed needed to last for gas, not for meals, because skipping dinner was familiar discomfort that he'd learned to ignore. Worked his 4-hour shift on empty stomach and emptier wallet, and the particular exhaustion that comes from giving away everything and having nothing left but the knowledge that you'd done what was right, even when right cost everything you had. Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., 24 hours after Jaden had given his last $15 to a crying stranger in a wedding dress, and worked his security shift on an empty stomach and gone home to his daughter wondering how he'd make it until Friday's paycheck. He was getting Maya ready for daycare, helping his 3-year-old into her jacket, and trying to explain why she couldn't have the snacks the other kids had, because Daddy would pay the fee Friday, and until then, she'd have to bring crackers from home. When he heard commotion outside his apartment building, noise that was unusual for their quiet, poor neighborhood, where the most excitement was usually sirens or arguments, not the sound of engines and voices and neighbors gathering like something extraordinary was happening. He looked out his window and saw 3 black limousines parked outside his building. Sleek, expensive vehicles that didn't belong in this neighborhood, where most people drove used cars or took buses, where wealth like this never appeared except in movies or dreams. And neighbors were gathering on sidewalks, pointing and speculating about what could bring limousines to their street, to their building, to a place where monthly rent was $800, and even that was hard to pay. "What's going on?" Jaden muttered to himself. Confusion mixing with the vague anxiety that unexpected things trigger when you're poor. When unusual occurrences usually mean problems, not opportunities. When your life experience teaches you that surprises are rarely good. A man in an expensive suit exited the first limousine, tailored clothing that probably cost more than Jaden made in a month, moving with the particular confidence of people whose wealth insulates them from doubt. And he looked up at the apartment building like he was searching for someone specific. "Are you Jaden Brooks?" the man called up, his voice carrying authority that suggested he was used to being listened to, used to getting answers to questions he asked. "Yeah," Jaden called back, suspicious because he didn't know this man, didn't know why someone in a suit that expensive would be looking for someone who lived in a studio apartment with his 3-year-old daughter. "Who are you?" "I'm Richard Bancroft," the man said, and the name meant nothing to Jaden, carried no recognition because Jaden didn't follow billionaires or business news or the particular celebrity of wealth. "Sophie's father. You helped my daughter yesterday." And suddenly everything clicked into place. The wedding dress and the crying and the $15. The stranger he'd helped, who he'd assumed he'd never see again, suddenly connected to this man in an expensive suit with 3 limousines parked outside a building where nobody owned even one nice car. Richard explained the story that Jaden had only seen fragments of, filled in the context that the wedding dress and tears had suggested but not revealed. Sophie was supposed to marry Preston Kane, Richard's business partner's son, marriage that was arranged for business merger between their companies, wedding that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with expanding empires that were already enormous. Sophie didn't love Preston, had tried to tell Richard this, but fathers sometimes hear what they want to hear instead of what their daughters desperately need them to hear. Preston was controlling and cold and treated Sophie like acquisition rather than person, and she'd run away from her own wedding because staying meant living a lie, meant being trapped in marriage that would destroy her. Her car had broken down and she'd been stranded with no phone and no money and complete helplessness. And a stranger, a man she'd never met, had given her his last $15 and told her to get somewhere safe, had helped without hesitation despite clearly needing that money himself. She'd used Jaden's $15 to call her father from a gas station payphone. Richard had rescued her, brought her home, and Sophie had told him everything about the stranger who'd saved her when she'd been completely lost and alone and terrified. Sophie exited the second limousine, and when she saw Jaden, she said, "Jaden, you came back." Confusion evident because she'd expected that he'd tracked her down or sought her out. Hadn't understood yet that this was where he lived, that the expensive neighborhood she'd imagined him returning from didn't exist. "I didn't go anywhere," Jaden said, gestured at the building behind him. "I live here." "I wanted to thank you," Sophie said, the words inadequate for what she was feeling, for what his kindness had meant when she'd needed it desperately. "You gave me your last money. My dad looked into you." Richard had hired a private investigator overnight because that's what billionaires do when they want information, when they need to understand who someone is beyond the surface interaction. And the investigator had found everything about Jaden's life that public records and employment verification and background checks could reveal. That Jaden worked 2 jobs, warehouse during the day and security at night. That he was a single father raising his daughter completely alone after Maya's mother had left and never come back. That he lived paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment where rent was constant struggle, where choosing between bills was monthly occurrence, where poverty was reality, not theoretical concept. That the $15 Jaden had given Sophie was literally his last money until Friday, wasn't extra or spare or disposable income, but everything he had, Money he needed for his daughter's daycare and gas to get to work and nothing else because there was nothing else in his budget. Money he'd given away despite having a child to feed, despite knowing that giving meant going without, despite understanding exactly what his generosity would cost him over the next 3 days. He gave it anyway to a stranger without hesitation, without asking questions or demanding explanations or wanting anything in return except that she be safe. "You gave my daughter everything you had," Richard said, his voice carrying emotion that wealth usually protects people from feeling, emotion that came from understanding what Jaden's gift had actually cost, what giving away your last money when you have a child depending on you actually means, when you had a child to feed, when you needed that money yourself more than most people need anything. "I want to give you something back." Richard opened a briefcase, revealed $15,000 in cash, $100 bills stacked neatly, 1,000 times what Jaden had given Sophie, wealth that represented months of Jaden's salary compressed into a briefcase. "This is for you. No strings attached. Just gratitude for saving my daughter when she needed saving." "I can't accept this," Jaden said immediately, the refusal automatic despite the fact that $15,000 would solve every problem in his life, would pay rent for a year, would cover daycare and food and gas, and all the small debts he'd accumulated surviving poverty, would give Maya things she needed that he couldn't afford, would transform everything. "Why not?" Richard asked. Genuine confusion because in his world you accepted money when money was offered. You didn't refuse gifts from billionaires. You didn't turn down opportunities that fell into your lap. "I didn't help her for money," Jaden said, the explanation simple and complete. "I helped because she needed help, because that's what you do when someone needs help and you can give it. The money doesn't matter." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Sophie said, tears forming, because she understood what Richard was only beginning to understand. That people who help without wanting reward are exactly the people who deserve reward most. That character like Jaden's was rare enough to be precious, valuable in ways that went beyond any dollar amount Richard could offer. "Fine," Richard said, when Jaden refused the $15,000 in cash, his voice showing respect for someone who wouldn't compromise their principles even when compromise would solve every financial problem they had, even when accepting would be logical and reasonable in what anyone else would do. "Not cash, then. How about a job? I own Bancroft Properties, real estate development company with properties across the state, buildings and apartments and commercial spaces that require management and oversight, and people who understand that business is about humans, not just transactions. I need someone in property management, someone who can work with tenants and handle problems and treat people with the kindness you showed my daughter. $65,000 to start. Full benefits, health insurance and dental and everything you need. Daycare covered completely, not as deduction but as company benefit because family matters." "I don't have a degree," Jaden said. The objection automatic because poverty teaches you to list reasons you're not qualified before anyone else can list them, teaches you that opportunities always have requirements you don't meet, that jobs like this go to people with credentials and connections and college educations that cost money Jaden had never had to spend. "You have something better," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built billions and understood that credentials weren't the same as character, that degrees measured education, not integrity. "Character. I can teach you real estate, can teach you property management and business practices and everything you need to know about running buildings. I can't teach kindness. I can't teach the kind of person who gives away their last $15 to a stranger, that you either have or you don't, and you have it, and that matters more than any degree." 3 months later, Jaden was working for Bancroft Properties in a job that felt impossible every time he walked into the office, was learning property management under Richard's mentorship, was discovering that he was good at this, that talking to tenants and solving problems and treating people with respect came naturally when you'd spent your life being the person who needed respect, who needed problems solved, who understood what it felt like to be invisible to people with power. He'd moved to a new apartment, two-bedroom place that Richard had helped him get by covering the security deposit that would have taken Jaden months to save. Apartment where Maya had her own room for the first time, where Jaden didn't wake up every morning stressing about whether he could afford rent. Maya was in better daycare, facility that was actually good instead of just affordable, where teachers knew children's names and cared about their development and provided snacks that Jaden didn't have to pay extra for, where his daughter thrived in ways that proved she'd been ready to thrive all along, just needed resources he hadn't been able to provide alone. Richard was mentoring Jaden with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted him to succeed, who saw potential that college admissions offices had never seen, who understood that intelligence and work ethic mattered more than credentials, who was investing in Jaden not as charity, but as recognition that good people deserve opportunities. 6 months after 3 limousines pulled up to his studio apartment building, Jaden was promoted to assistant property manager with a salary of $75,000, number that represented more than double what he'd been making working 2 jobs, number that meant he had savings for the first time in his adult life, had money left over after rent and daycare and food, had the particular security of knowing that unexpected expenses wouldn't destroy him, that Maya's childhood could include things beyond just survival. Maya was thriving in ways that made Jaden cry when he picked her up from daycare, and she told him about her day with the enthusiasm of children who are happy, who are safe, who are loved not just by their father, but by a world that suddenly had room for them. Jaden and Sophie had become genuine friends, relationship built on mutual rescue because she'd saved him as much as he'd saved her. Sophie visiting Maya regularly because the 3-year-old had become important to her. Because watching Jaden parent with the devotion and patience and love he showed every day taught Sophie what family could be when it wasn't about obligation or business arrangements. "You saved me that day," Sophie told Jaden during one of her visits, the statement referring to more than just the $15 or the ride to safety, referring to being seen by someone who expected nothing in return, being helped by someone who had nothing to give. "You saved me too," Jaden replied. The gratitude going both ways because Sophie and Richard had transformed his life, had opened doors he hadn't known existed, had proven that kindness could be reciprocated in ways that changed everything. 1 year after counting his last $15 at a gas station, Jaden was managing properties for Bancroft with a salary of $95,000, had bought his first new car instead of the used beater he'd been driving that broke down constantly, had started a college fund for Maya that would mean she'd never have to choose between education and survival the way he'd had to choose. Richard told him regularly that, "You're family now. Not employer talking to employee, but father figure to someone who'd lost his own father young. Mentor to mentee who'd become something deeper than professional relationship." Sophie was still unmarried, had never gone back to Preston despite pressure from business partners and society expectations, had learned to choose herself, to prioritize her own happiness over other people's plans for her life. "I learned to choose myself," she told Jaden. "You taught me that by choosing to help me when you had every reason to focus on yourself." Jaden kept the original $15, the same bills he'd handed Sophie that Tuesday morning, because Sophie had given them back framed with a plaque that read, "The $15 that changed everything." Symbol of the moment when giving away everything led to receiving more than he could have imagined. The frame hung in his office at Bancroft Properties, reminder of where he'd come from and what mattered more than money. Reminder that character was currency that appreciated rather than depreciated, that kindness was investment with returns you couldn't calculate but could definitely feel. One evening when Jaden was putting Maya to bed in her own room in their two-bedroom apartment that felt like mansion compared to the studio they'd shared, his 4-year-old daughter asked with a particular directness of children who haven't learned that some questions are complicated, "Daddy, why did you help that lady?" "Because helping people matters more than money," Jaden said. The answer simple, even though the implications were complex. Even though teaching his daughter this lesson meant teaching her to sometimes choose sacrifice over security, compassion over comfort, even when it costs you everything, even when you have nothing to give except the little you have. You give it because that's what good people do, because that's who we are, because money comes and goes, but character stays forever. "Did she pay you back?" Maya asked. "Accounting that 4-year-olds understand? Fairness that children learn early." "In ways I never expected," Jaden said, looking around the room that existed because he'd given away $15. Looking at his daughter who was thriving because he'd chosen compassion over calculation. Looking at the life he had that proved sometimes given away. Everything is how you gain everything. Jaden Brooks counted $15 at a gas station at 7:42 a.m., money that had to last until Friday and cover his daughter's daycare snack fee and gas to get to work for 3 more days. And saw Sophie Bancroft crying in her wedding dress with a flat tire and no phone and no money and no way to call for help, stranded and terrified and completely alone. And he handed her his last $15 because some choices aren't about math, aren't about whether you can afford to help when you're barely affording to survive, aren't about calculating cost-benefit analysis of giving away money you desperately need, but about whether you can afford not to help, whether you can live with yourself if you drive past someone in crisis because helping would be inconvenient, whether the person you want to be is the person who gives or the person who keeps. It wasn't just money, wasn't just $15 that represented 3 days of survival, wasn't random act of kindness that cost nothing and meant little, was a billionaire's daughter who'd run from an arranged marriage and was stranded on the side of the road, wearing a wedding dress because choosing herself had meant losing everything she'd been raised to value, and a single father working 2 jobs who had nothing but gave everything anyway because helping mattered more than his own comfort. And 24 hours later, 3 limousines pulled up to Jaden's apartment building in a neighborhood where limousines never appeared. And Richard Bancroft offered Jaden everything from $15,000 in cash to a career that would transform his entire life. Because his daughter's life had been saved, her courage to run had been supported, her moment of complete helplessness had been met with kindness from someone who had nothing but gave everything. That $15 became $65,000 salary that doubled what Jaden had been making working twice as hard, became mentorship and opportunity, and Richard teaching Jaden real estate, while Jaden taught Richard what character looked like when it cost everything, became family between people who'd been strangers 24 hours before limousines arrived, became Sophie visiting Maya, and Richard calling Jaden family in a life that proved sometimes the worst financial decision is the best human decision. Because sometimes giving away your last dollar isn't sacrifice, but investment in becoming the person you want to be, teaching your daughter the values that matter more than money, creating karma that returns in forms you never expected. And sometimes the person you help in their worst moment becomes the person who changes your entire life, who opens doors you didn't know existed, who proves that kindness isn't weakness but currency that appreciates forever. Sometimes giving away everything you have opens doors you didn't know existed, creates opportunities you couldn't have planned, connects you with people who transform your life in ways no amount of saving or calculating or self-preservation could ever accomplish. Would you give a stranger your last money if they desperately needed it? If helping them meant you couldn't feed yourself for 3 days? If kindness cost everything but felt like the only choice you could live with? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Because somewhere right now, someone is counting their last $15 and seeing a stranger in crisis and trying to decide whether helping matters more than surviving. And maybe they need to know that sometimes giving away everything is how you receive everything. That sometimes a person crying in a wedding dress with a flat tire is a billionaire's daughter whose gratitude will change your life. And that character is investment that always pays returns even when returns take 24 hours and arrive in 3 limousines you never saw coming.